Cary Grant was one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, known for his charm and good looks on screen. But according to his daughter Jennifer Grant, the man the world saw was very similar to who he really was at home. The difference was in what he had to hide. In early 2024, Jennifer Grant appeared on CBS Sunday Morning for an emotional interview. When the host gently asked her about the long-standing rumors regarding her father's sexuality, the studio went quiet. Jennifer looked up with tired eyes, not angry or ashamed, but exhausted from carrying a secret for so long. She said slowly that people always talked about Randolph Scott as if he was the only one, but he wasn't. He was just the only man her father ever dared to love openly. The Great Love, Randolph Scott. Jennifer's words opened a door that Hollywood had tried to keep closed for decades. The relationship between Cary Grant and Randolph Scott was well known in the industry, but nobody dared speak about it honestly. They first met in 1932 during a costume fitting for the movie Hot Saturday at Paramount Studios. Cary was still a newcomer from Britain, while Randolph was already an established leading man with perfect movie star looks. According to Jennifer, her father once told her that when they met, everyone was looking at him, but he was only looking at Randolph. He knew his life had just begun. A few weeks later, Cary moved into Randolph's mansion in Brentwood. The press later called it the sanctuary of Hollywood's strange best friend couples. For 12 years, they lived together like a married couple. They shared cooking duties, worked in the garden together, walked their dog, and hung framed photos in their living room. In 1935, a reporter from Photoplay magazine snuck into their garden and took photos of them playing basketball in the backyard, wearing striped pajamas with no shirts. The photo was naked, but Paramount quickly bought the rights and paid the magazine $200 to make sure it never appeared in print. Hollywood didn't have social media then, but it had something more frightening: gossip columnists with powerful reach. Journalist Hedda Hopper once hinted in her column about two gentlemen in a beautiful house in Santa Monica who lived just like a newlywed couple. This line became the talk of every Hollywood party and created so much suspicion that Paramount had to step in. In April 1944, Cary received a telegram with just 11 words from a top studio executive. "Cut ties or cut contract, you decide." There was no name and no explanation needed. Cary understood perfectly. That night, he packed his belongings quietly without saying anything to Randolph. He left at 3 o'clock in the morning, leaving only a handwritten note under their silver teapot. "You told me to live true, but nobody allowed me to do so." Randolph Scott, known throughout Hollywood as a tough cowboy-type actor, cried all night. Their gardener later wrote in his memoir that Scott didn't leave his room for 3 days. Just a week later, Randolph announced his engagement to heiress Marion DuPont in a quick, private wedding in South Carolina with no media attention. When Jennifer was 19, she asked her father if he truly loved Randolph. Instead of answering with words, Cary quietly opened a small wooden box from his desk drawer. Inside was a yellowed photo from Thanksgiving 1936, showing both men wearing aprons while carving a turkey together. Written underneath in black ink were the words, "Days without being watched." Jennifer said her father wasn't usually sentimental, but she never saw him throw away that photo or replace it with anyone else's picture. Even in 1987, nearly 10 years after Randolph's death, Cary visited Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale every January 3rd, carrying a single, white carnation. Only his driver Paul Sanders knew about these visits. According to Sanders, Cary never spoke Randolph's name at the grave, but always whispered the same phrase: "If you hadn't walked out of that house, maybe I'd be living differently today." The Hidden Romance, Jerome Zerby. In 1937, while Hollywood was busy with musical films, Cary was secretly spending time in New York. He had just finished The Awful Truth and was taking unannounced vacations. Nobody knew where he stayed until a reporter spotted him leaving the apartment building where Jerome Zerby lived. Jerome wasn't just any photographer. He was the man behind the most sought-after portraits of New York's wealthy elite. He also wrote a society column for Town and Country magazine. He had power, but chose never to write about Cary. Only once did he mention Mr. G in his personal diary on June 13, 1937. We had dinner in a tiny kitchen with the lights off and just a sad jazz record playing. I didn't take a single photo because the most beautiful things that night were real. Cary and Jerome lived together in that small apartment for nearly 3 months. Nobody knows exactly how long their relationship lasted because all evidence, photos, letters, journals, disappeared after a shocking incident that summer. A Paramount assistant producer named Larry Wexler happened to see Cary kissing Jerome backstage during a magazine photo shoot. The next day, this information reached the studio's communications director. 5 days later, Jerome was invited to meet with Robert Evans, who later became a Hollywood legend, but was then a young image manager hired to handle off-script problems. Jennifer recalls what her father told her about that meeting. They gave Jerome a cream-colored envelope containing an $8,000 check and a lifetime silence agreement. Jerome said nothing, nodded, and walked away. Cary never heard from him again. After 1937, Jerome almost vanished from Hollywood. He moved to Connecticut, later settled in Paris, and only photographed landscapes. In a brief 1955 interview with a French newspaper, when asked about the stars he once knew, he replied with just one line: "Some people can't stay, and some memories never want to leave." Jerome lost everything, his reputation, career, and past, because of one backstage moment. Jennifer says her father never forgave himself for this. He would sit for hours in his study at night with the lights off. When she asked what he was thinking, he would just shake his head and say, "I had a place to love others, but not a place to love myself." The brief encounter. Richard Blackwell. Richard Blackwell became famous for his worst-dressed lists, but few people knew he once had a romance with Cary Grant. In March 1949, after an awards ceremony at the Beverly Hills Hotel, all the cameras focused on stars like Olivia de Havilland and Gregory Peck. But Richard, then 25, was just a young actor under Universal's training program, managed by the powerful Henry Wilson. Richard had no major roles, but he had something that scared every man in the industry: otherworldly beauty. He had pale gray eyes and a voice like honey. During the party, Cary noticed Richard the moment he entered the ballroom, but things really began when they rode the elevator alone afterward. In his memoir, Richard wrote that Cary said nothing but just looked at him with eyes unlike anyone had ever looked at him before. Then Cary kissed him. This story might have stayed hidden if not for a careless moment. A Hollywood reporter following Henry Wilson spotted Richard leaving Cary's hotel room at 2:00 a.m. 2 days later, an anonymous gossip column appeared. A newly famous heartthrob is perhaps a bit too cozy with the so-called black cat of the casting world. The studios exploded with anger. Henry Wilson was called to Universal's executive office, but Richard was dealt with first. Jennifer heard this story from one of her father's former secretaries. When Cary read that gossip, he threw his drink at the wall and said something she'll never forget. "I wouldn't just lose my career if this got out. I would lose my daughter too if she was ever born into a world that doesn't forgive." This rage turned into action. Cary immediately demanded that all contact with Richard cease and that all correspondence be destroyed, even backstage photos taken together. Then Warner Brothers sent an official warning letter to Richard. If he ever mentioned Cary Grant's name again, all his pending contracts would be instantly canceled. Expelled from Hollywood in silence, Richard left with just one suitcase. The lesson was clear. Being in love with someone like Cary Grant, even for one night, was enough to ruin your entire future. Richard moved into fashion design, and that's when the name Mr. Blackwell was born, along with his infamous worst-dressed list that terrified celebrities for 3 decades. Jennifer remembers a party in Malibu in 1952 when she was only 6. She saw a man standing in the corner of the yard, wearing a white vest, not smiling or speaking, his gaze fixed on a man with black hair wearing a dark velvet suit. Years later, she learned that was Richard. When Richard turned away, her father finished his drink and walked inside without a word. When her mother asked what happened, he just shook his head and said, "People only truly love you when they can't stay." This might have been the last time they saw each other, but the consequences lasted forever. Jennifer admits this was the first time she saw her father use sleeping pills, green jade-like pills he hid deep in his desk drawer. Whenever he thought of someone, he'd swallow one as if trying to erase himself. The first love. Ori Kelly. The deepest love in Cary's memory was also his very first. Ori Kelly, the Oscar-winning costume designer who shared a room with Cary in New York before he became famous, around 1930. Jennifer tells how they shared a tiny room with just one single bed so narrow they had to sleep at angles to avoid hitting the wall. Every night her father spoke in his British accent with a touch of American, while Ori laughed back in his thick Australian accent. They lived together for nearly 2 years, sharing boiled egg meals, half-read books, and shattered dreams after casting rejections. In his 1965 memoir, Women I've Undressed, Ori wrote that Cary once told him, "If someday I become famous, I will never forget you." But Hollywood doesn't let people keep such promises. When Paramount invited Cary to screen test in Los Angeles in 1931, he left without saying goodbye or writing a letter. He only left a hastily written note by his bed that read, "If we meet again, let's pretend I never left you." Ori arrived in Hollywood 2 years later, not as a roommate, but as a costume designer. In 1942, he won his first Oscar for An American in Paris. Ori sent Cary an invitation to the celebration, not to show off his win, but to see if Cary had kept their old promise. Cary didn't attend, but a few days later, Ori received a leather envelope at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. Inside was a $5,000 check and a note. "For the nights when you stayed, even when I didn't deserve it." Jennifer learned about Ori not from her father, but by accident. He had a wooden box hidden in his closet. One night after drinking, he murmured in his sleep, "Ori, don't go." The next morning, he sat silently for hours, not eating or speaking, just staring out the window. That was the day Jennifer saw him open the box and take out a black and white photo of 2 men standing next to each other, looking towards some place nobody knew. In Ori's memoir, he reveals that in 1947, when Cary accepted a role in The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer, he called Ori at midnight saying he wanted to meet. They spent 3 hours together at a deserted bar on Sunset Boulevard. Nobody knows what they talked about, but the bartender that night later told the Los Angeles Times that the man named Cary cried and said, "I don't know who I am anymore. Everyone only knows my face on screen. But the one who knows the real me, I've let go." That same year, Ori suddenly quit the film industry with no explanation. He bought a small home in Palm Springs, lived as a recluse, and refused all comeback invitations, even from Warner Brothers for My Fair Lady. Jennifer closes this part with a telling observation. "My father never spoke Ori's name aloud, but every time someone mentioned the Oscars on TV, he would go into another room. I believe he wasn't avoiding the award. He was avoiding the memory of the person who made him believe in love before he was famous enough to have to hide it." The marriages, doors he tried to open. When a reporter asked Jennifer if her father married to cover up his sexuality, she didn't flinch or dodge the question. She looked straight ahead and answered slowly, as if every word had been waiting in her chest for decades. Yes, partly to survive, partly to meet expectations, but that didn't make him a liar. It made him a victim of his time. In the 1940s and 1950s, Hollywood didn't just control a star's image, it controlled their private lives. Cary signed a 7-year contract with Paramount that included a clause about maintaining the standard masculine image, a phrase Jennifer later found in archived legal documents at her father's law office. So he had to marry, had to appear beside women, had to build an image the public could worship without suspicion. Behind that image was a lonely man who needed sleeping pills just to fall asleep at night, and who knocked on his therapist's door at midnight out of fear of being exposed. Virginia Cherrill, star of City Lights, was the first woman to walk down the aisle with Cary in 1934. They married in London after only 3 months of dating, but everything collapsed within a year. Jennifer recalled her father's words. "I tried to love the way people expected me to, but the heart doesn't. He listened to anyone." In 1942, he married Barbara Hutton, heiress to the Woolworth fortune and one of the richest women in the world. The media called them the golden couple of Hollywood and Wall Street. But Jennifer said her father always felt like he was playing a role, not really living. He smiled on cue and spoke from a script, but there was always emptiness in his eyes. His third wife, Betsy Drake, was the only woman who stood by Cary while he struggled with his identity. They married in 1949 and explored meditation together, reading Indian philosophy and experimenting with LSD. Jennifer said LSD helped her father touch the parts of himself he had always denied, his true identity. Betsy didn't object. In fact, she wrote down his psychological journey in journals as therapy. But Hollywood didn't approve. A Warner Brothers executive called Cary into a private meeting and said bluntly, "If you keep talking about LSD, we'll cancel your next 3 films." The marriage didn't end out of hatred, but out of awakening. Cary could no longer pretend to be the perfect husband, and Betsy didn't want to watch him slowly die behind a mask. Then came his final marriage to Diane Cannon, the only woman to give him a child, Jennifer. She was the reason Cary hoped just once more that he could live a normal life, but the truth was, he couldn't. Jennifer said she was the best thing her parents had together, but her father didn't belong in the shell that society forced him to wear. In 1968, after signing the divorce papers, Deanne walked out of the Los Angeles courthouse in silence. When a reporter asked her for a comment about the marriage, she simply shook her head. But years later, she published a memoir recalling a night when Cary cried alone in the bathroom, his hands trembling, whispering again and again, "I want to be myself, but I don't know who that is." The truth revealed, he was nothing left to hide and no more reason to deny. Jennifer Grant looked straight into the camera lens, unflinching and unwavering. In that moment, she was no longer just the daughter of a silver screen legend, but the only one brave enough to name a truth that Hollywood had buried for nearly a century. "He never came out," Jennifer said, her voice soft as a sigh but sharp enough to pierce through the glossy image that once covered Cary Grant's life. "But he lived honestly in the quiet moments, in his eyes, in gentle touches no one saw." She shared that in those nights when he sat alone on hotel balconies, staring out at the ocean while holding a cigarette he never lit. She used to think he was waiting for something. Now she knows he was remembering someone. In 1999, 3 years after her father passed away, Jennifer finally dared to unlock the wooden box he left behind. Inside were hundreds of letters that were never sent. No addresses, only dates. One was marked Malibu, May 1959. Another said New York, the night before the 1963 Oscars. Some were scribbled on hotel napkins. One letter filled an entire page, but ended with only one line. "I wish we had been born in a different time." Jennifer admitted there were times she felt angry at him. Why live in silence? Why choose to hide to the point where every marriage turned into a dead end, and every real love flickered only to be extinguished like it never existed? But over time, she began to understand. Not everyone has the privilege to live openly in a world that thrives on control. Her father once told her, when she was 16 and they were staying at Claridge's in London, "Sweetheart, love doesn't need proof. It only needs permission to exist." That line still catches in her throat even now. Hollywood once called him one of the most charming gentlemen in cinema history, but Jennifer remembers him as a lonely man who traded personal freedom to preserve his stardom and quietly lived his truth in small, unnoticed ways. The legacy. When Cary Grant passed away on November 29, 1986, at age 82, people lined up outside the theater in Davenport, Iowa, not just to bid farewell to a silver screen legend, but to take one last look at a man who carried a secret that, until his final breath, no one dared to name. On paper, Cary left behind an estate worth over $60 million, most of it entrusted to Jennifer and several nonprofit organizations supporting arts education. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. Cary Grant left behind the courage to live with pain and a mirror for Hollywood to face itself, even if it once chose to look away. In her 2011 memoir, Good Stuff, Jennifer revealed that her father once said, "They remember the films, but they forget the real man, and I accept that." For decades, Cary chose to let his truest self live only in never-mailed letters, private notes, and silent glances toward people the press never clearly captured. He was the primary donor for an LGBTQ film scholarship program at UCLA under a false name. Jennifer only found out after his death when she received a thank you letter from a young student that read, "I don't know who you are, but thank you for letting me learn how to tell my own story." Inside the safe at his Beverly Hills mansion, alongside property deeds and old scripts, was an unfinished manuscript for a stage play titled The Other Man. The story centered on a famous actor living in a society that wouldn't allow him to love the person he truly loved. Nobody knows why Cary never released it, but later biographers believed it was his spiritual will. Jennifer once said, "If I had to summarize my father's legacy in one sentence, it would be, he spent his whole life protecting his secret and died so that others wouldn't have to." Today, as Hollywood becomes more open, people are beginning to remember Cary not only as a style icon and screen idol, but as one of the bravest men to have ever lived in silence, a man who once used his spotlight to hide his true heart, but also used that same heart to plant hope for generations to come. All the names mentioned, Randolph Scott, Jerome Zerby, Richard Blackwell, Ori Kelly, weren't just fragments of a hidden love life. They were living proof of a truth Hollywood spent decades trying to bury. Not because Cary Grant was weak, but because he lived in an era where courage had to be hidden in glances, undelivered letters, and embraces with no witnesses. Jennifer Grant spoke up in her father's place, but the question remains. How many others like him are still buried beneath the dazzling spotlight, never to be named? The story of Cary Grant reminds us that behind every perfect image, there may be a human being struggling to live their truth in a world not ready to accept it.